The summer Cassie Varden turned 21, she learned that grief and debt arrive together, and they never leave in the same order they came. Her father, Dale Varden, had been a union electrician for 23 years, the kind of man who could read a circuit diagram the way other men read a newspaper quickly without effort, with the easy confidence of someone fluent in a language most people never learn. He had large hands permanently calloused at the fingertips from decades of wire stripping, and he wore the same Carhartt jacket to every job. Regardless of the season, the right breast pocket always holding a stubby carpenter's pencil and a folded piece of graph paper where he sketched his layouts before he ever touched a wire. He had raised Cassie alone after her mother left when Cassie was 4, and he had done it without complaint and without explanation, the way he did most things by simply showing up every day and doing what needed to be done. He taught her to solder when she was 9, standing on an overturned milk crate in his garage workshop, her safety goggles fogged with concentration. He taught her to read a voltmeter to identify load-bearing walls, to listen to the sound a building made when something inside it was wrong. Buildings talk, he used to say, not dramatically, but as plain fact, the way he stated all the important things. You just have to know what you're listening for. He was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer in November of Cassie's sophomore year at UNLV, where she was studying environmental engineering on a partial academic scholarship. He told her over the phone on a Tuesday evening, and the first thing he said after was, "Don't come home, I'll handle it." She came home the next morning. The treatment lasted 14 months. There were surgeries, and then there were complications from the surgeries, and then there were infections, and then there were the drugs to fight the infections. And each new category of crisis arrived with its own billing department, and its own stack of paperwork, and its own incomprehensible series of codes that translated in the end into the same thing: more money than they had, more debt than they could imagine accumulating, at a rate that made the original sum feel almost quaint in retrospect. Dale Varden died on a Wednesday morning in March in a hospital bed in Henderson, Nevada, with Cassie sitting in the chair beside him and his old Zippo lighter in her left hand, the one he'd carried since his time at Fort Bragg, the one engraved with his initials, and the base's name in letters worn nearly smooth from 30 years of handling. He had asked her to hold it. She didn't ask why, she just held it. After the funeral, a small one. A dozen people from the Union Hall, a brief graveside service in the high desert wind. Cassie drove home and sat at the kitchen table and opened the manila folder her father's attorney had prepared. The house had 18 months of mortgage arrears. The medical debt totaled $280,000. The partial scholarship at UNLV had lapsed during her leave of absence. The used 2006 Ford F-150 in the driveway was worth approximately $9,000 in its current condition, which was not good. She sat with the folder for a long time. Then she closed it, put it back on the table, and went out to the garage. She welded for 4 hours, not anything specific. Just beads, long, careful beads on scrap steel plate, the arc precise, and even the way her father had taught her. The physical concentration of it, the requirement that your hands and your eyes be entirely present in the same moment, was the only thing that reliably quieted the noise in her head. She had been doing contract welding for 9 months, picking up jobs through 2 different fabrication shops in a construction company that needed someone reliable with thin-gauge structural work. She was good at it, better than most people twice her age, according to the shop foreman at Cascade Fabrication, who had offered her a full-time position 3 times and been turned down 3 times because the contract work paid better and let her set her own hours around her father's appointments. Now the appointments were finished. Now there was only the debt in the house and the folder on the kitchen table. The bank sent its letter in July. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days. The balance needed to prevent them was $64,000. Cassie had $4,211 in her checking account. She did the math several different ways, hoping one of them would produce a different result. None of them did. It was the second week of August when her friend Nadia, a paralegal at a civil practice in downtown Henderson, called to mention that the Washoe County tax deed auction was happening the following Tuesday, and that she had heard the county clerk's office was looking for temporary help with document processing. The pay was modest, but it was steady, and it might lead to something more permanent if Cassie was interested. Cassie was interested in anything that kept the lights on. She put on her best interview clothes, which were not particularly impressive. Dark slacks, a white button-down shirt, boots that were clean but not new, and drove the 40 minutes to the Washoe County Courthouse in Reno on a Tuesday morning when the temperature at 8 a.m. was already 91 degrees and climbing towards something the Weather Service was calling dangerous. The courthouse was aggressively air-conditioned in the way of government buildings that have one setting and no interest in adjusting it, and the cold hit Cassie like a wall as she pushed through the glass doors. She found the clerk's office on the second floor, knocked on the door marked administration, and was told by a woman who didn't look up from her computer screen that the position had been filled on Friday. Cassie stood in the hallway for a moment. The drive back would take 40 minutes. The temperature outside was now, according to her phone, 97 degrees, and the truck's air conditioning was what her father had charitably called aspirational. She had a bottle of water and a half-eaten granola bar in her bag. She could hear from somewhere down the hall the sound of a man's amplified voice reading numbers and addresses in the flat, reciting cadence of official proceedings. She walked toward the sound. The tax deed auction was held in the county's secondary hearing room, a wood-paneled space with 3 rows of padded folding chairs facing a raised dais where a sweating, red-faced man named Cecil Drum presided over a microphone and a laptop screen with the barely contained enthusiasm of someone who understood that his job was important in a technical sense and tedious in every other. The room held perhaps 20 people, a mix of local developers and business, casual, a few contractors with the dust of job sites still on them, and several individuals who appeared to be attending purely for the air conditioning, which Cassie respected. She took a seat in the back row. The properties came and went in a steady, joyless rhythm. Vacant desert parcels, an abandoned storage facility, a dilapidated duplex in a flood zone. Each lot provoked a brief negotiation, sometimes animated, mostly not, and the gavel came down and the next file was opened, and Drum's voice resumed its level metronomic reading of addresses and lien amounts and square footages. Cassie watched and let the cold air work on her shoulders and thought about nothing in particular, which was a kind of relief. "All right," Drum said, shuffling papers. "Moving on to Lot 404. He paused just for a half-second in the way that even a practiced auctioneer pauses when a property is so strange that neutrality requires a brief internal effort. "We have a commercial parcel, Highway 95, approximately 12 miles north of the city limits. 3 acres of land plus the existing structure." He looked at his screen. The existing structure being the Desert Crown Casino, 9-story construction pyramid form, approximately 180 feet at the apex. Glass panel exterior. He cleared his throat. Decommissioned 1989. Starting bid is $170 to cover the immediate administrative liens. Do I hear 170 with Shorsh? A sound moved through the room that was not quite laughter and not quite a groan, but something between the two. The collective exhale of people who have been in a room long enough to recognize a joke when the auctioneer says it with a straight face. Cassie had not been paying close attention. She had been thinking about whether there was a coffee machine in the courthouse and whether she had enough in her wallet to justify the expense. But the words cut through her inattention with a peculiar clarity. 9-story pyramid. 180 feet. Glass exterior. She turned it over in her mind. A pyramid. A glass pyramid. In the Nevada desert on Highway 95. She had driven Highway 95 hundreds of times. She had never seen a pyramid. Ladies and gentlemen, Drum said, the patience of a man who has done this for 20 years evident in every syllable. The Desert Crown represents 3 acres of commercial land with highway frontage and... "What happened to the glass?" Cassie said. The room turned to look at her. Drum blinked. "I'm sorry. You said glass panel exterior, 9 stories of glass panels. What happened to them?" "The majority of the glass exterior panels," Drum said, consulting his notes with the expression of a man reading something he personally found absurd, "have sustained weather and structural damage over the 35-year vacancy period and are in various states of disrepair." "How various?" The county assessment notes approximately 60 to 70% panel failure. 60 to 70% of the glass on a 9-story pyramid. Cassie was doing a different kind of math now, the automatic kind. Her hands did the kind that thought in materials and weights and what things were worth when they were broken down into their components. She looked at the room. No one was raising a hand. She thought about the folder on her kitchen table. She thought about $64,000 and 4,211 in the distance between them. She thought about her father's voice, easy and certain. When the table is cold, you roll. She had never understood exactly what he meant by that. She wasn't sure she understood it now, but her hand went up before she had decided to raise it, some part of her moving on its own authority, and she said 170. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something has happened that everyone present will remember distinctly but interpret differently. Drum looked at her. I have a bid of $170 from, he squinted, from the young lady in the back row. Ma'am, are you aware of the environmental and structural liabilities attached to Lot 4? Oh, 4. I am, Cassie said. She wasn't. She had been told there was asbestos somewhere in the general geography of the state of Nevada, and she had absorbed this information in the same vague way she had absorbed the heat. Fair enough? Drum nodded slowly, the practiced neutrality of an auctioneer who has seen stranger things than this. Going once, going twice. The gavel fell. Sold $170 to the young lady in the back. In the front row, a man in a charcoal jacket that was too expensive for the room turned to look at her. He was perhaps 55, trim and silver-haired, with a particular quality of stillness that certain men cultivate when they want to appear relaxed and reveal instead that they are never relaxed. His name, as Cassie would learn much later, was Declan Ashby, though that wasn't his real name. You just bought yourself a very expensive problem, he said. His voice was smooth and even, and the pitying smile on his face was so perfectly calibrated that it took Cassie a moment to recognize it as something other than genuine concern. I hope you know what you're doing. Thanks, Cassie said. She did not know what she was doing. She walked to the clerk's desk. She counted out 8 20s and a 10 from her wallet, signed a stack of documents she did not fully read and received in exchange a transfer of deed for 3 acres of Highway 95 commercial property and a 9-story glass pyramid in the Nevada desert. Then she walked out into the 100-degree heat, crossed the parking lot to her father's truck, sat in the driver's seat, and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. She stayed that way for a while. $170. She had $194 left in her wallet, which meant she had $24 to her name, which was not enough for groceries for the week, which was a problem she would address later after she had addressed the problem of having just purchased a derelict pyramid in the Mojave. She started the truck. Highway 95 stretched north from the city like something drawn by a ruler and then forgotten. The landscape on either side was the particular desolation of the high Nevada desert in August scrub and rock, in cracked caliche earth. Occasional clusters of Joshua trees leaning slightly away from the prevailing wind, as though they had somewhere to be and had been delayed. The heat shimmer on the road ahead made the horizon liquid, unreliable, constantly retreating. Cassie had the windows down because the air conditioning was in fact aspirational. The hot air moved through the cab and took nothing with it. She drove with her elbow on the door and the deed folded in the center console, and the Zippo sitting on the dashboard where her father had always kept it, a habit she had unconsciously maintained since March. She saw it from a long way off. She had been watching the horizon for it, knowing approximately where the 12-mile marker was, knowing the structure was 180 feet tall, and therefore should be visible well before the turnoff. But knowing something would be visible and being prepared for what it actually looked like, where she was discovering entirely different propositions. The Black Pyramid rose from the desert floor with the absolute uncompromising verticality of something that had no interest in fitting into its surroundings. 9 stories of steel-frame glass-paneled construction built in the form of a stepped pyramid, each story slightly narrower than the one below, the whole structure tapering from a broad base. The county records would later tell her, this footprint covered 40,000 square feet to a narrow apex where a massive light fixture, a searchlight of the kind that movie premieres used to employ, had once projected a beam visible 40 miles in any direction. The glass was gone. Not all of it, 20 or 30%, still clung to the steel frames, Drum had said. 60 to 70% failure, which meant at least 30% survival. But what remained caught the afternoon sun at angles that sent light scattering across the desert in fragments. Thousands of small bright shards of refracted Nevada afternoon, as though the pyramid were engaged in a slow, continuous process of dismantling itself into light. What had fallen lay around the base in a rough perimeter, 30 years of glass collapse, creating a gleaming moat, the broken panels reduced by weather and time to a gravel of glittering black-tinted chips that spread 20 feet from the walls in every direction, crunching under the truck's tires as Cassie turned off the highway and into what had once been a parking lot. She stopped the truck and sat with the engine running and looked at it. The building was a monument to a particular kind of American ambition, the ambition that builds things that have no business existing in the place where they are built, that looks at a tract of empty desert and decides to put a 9-story glass pyramid on it that takes the excess of one era and makes it permanent in steel and concrete and glass. The neon crown that had once topped the casino signage had collapsed inward at some point during the vacancy, its tubing shattered its support structure, now a rusted abstract sculpture 3 stories up the east face. The grand entrance, once featuring golden statues according to the county's historical records, was sealed with plywood that had warped and cracked in the heat until it was more symbolic barrier than actual one. Cassie turned off the engine. The silence that followed had weight to it, the deep, dry silence of a desert location far enough from the highway that traffic noise didn't reach. Just wind, very light, moving through the broken glass frames with a sound like breathing. She got out. The heat hit her immediately, concrete and asphalt radiating the day's accumulation, and she stood beside the truck and looked up at the pyramid for a long moment. Then she went to the truck bed and pulled out her crowbar and her heavy flashlight and her canvas tool bag, put on her work gloves, and went to find the service entrance. It was on the north face, a steel door hanging loose on its lower hinge, in a way that suggested it had been opened many times over the years by many people with similar intentions. Inside, the heat intensified rather than diminishing the sealed interior of the building, having spent 30 years conducting and storing whatever the desert sent its way. The smell hit her at the same moment, stale cigarette smoke from a different era. Mildew dust so old it had developed its own distinct character, and beneath all of it, something Cassie couldn't quite name, a closed ancient smell. The smell of a place that had been sealed against time and had simply absorbed it instead. She clicked on her flashlight. The interior of the Desert Crown Casino's main floor was a cavern. Slot machines stood in rows, their glass faces dark and mostly shattered, their mechanical innards visible through the gaps. Delicate gearing and lever mechanisms that now served no purpose but looked in the flashlight beam like the organs of something dissected. Blackjack tables lay overturned under collapsed ceiling tiles. The carpet, originally crimson, according to photographs in the county's historical file, had faded to a uniform gray-brown and was actively decomposing in the areas where moisture had found its way through the damaged roof sections. Cassie moved through the space methodically, the way her father had taught her, to assess an unfamiliar structure slowly, with the light moving ahead of her, looking for the electrical boxes first. She found the first junction panel behind the main bar, pried it open, and found it stripped clean. Every wire, every cable, every copper component down to the grounding lugs had been removed with professional efficiency. She checked 3 more panels. Same result. The scavengers had come in the early 90s, she would later learn, within a year of the casino's closure, and they had been thorough in the specific, efficient way of people who know what they're looking for and how to get it out quickly. Every accessible run of copper wire, every aluminum junction box, every component worth more than the labor to remove it had been excised from the building's infrastructure as cleanly as surgical extraction. She spent 3 hours working through the main floor, the 2 secondary gaming rooms, and the service corridor that connected them. Her pile of salvageable material, short sections of copper pipe from a bathroom fitting that the scavengers had missed, a coil of aluminum conduit behind a wall panel, 3 brass door hinges amounted to perhaps $12 at current scrap prices. She sat down on the edge of a craps table and did the math she had been avoiding. $12 in salvage, $194 in her wallet, Now 124 after the bid. $64,000 needed to prevent foreclosure. 4 days until the bank's deadline. She was not a woman given to catastrophizing. Her father had raised her to deal with problems one step at a time, to identify the next concrete action, and take it to resist the temptation to look at the whole mountain when the whole mountain was too large to usefully contemplate. But sitting in the dark of an abandoned casino she had just bought for $170, with $12 in salvage and 4 days until the bank started proceedings, on the house she had grown up in. The mountain was difficult to avoid looking at. She was still sitting there when the wind changed. It came in through the broken upper panels of the pyramid's west face, where the steel frame was most exposed, and it brought with it the leading edge of a dust storm that had been building over the desert since early afternoon, a phenomenon the region produced several times each summer. A haboob in the local terminology, a wall of suspended dust that could reach 1,500 feet high and reduce visibility to zero in minutes. Cassie heard it before she could see it, a deep bass pressure change, a sound that was less sound than sensation. And then the light through the broken sections of the pyramid changed from late afternoon gold to a flat ochre murk. She went to the nearest intact section of the ground floor wall and pressed her hand to the glass. Outside, the sky had turned the color of old brass. The parking lot was invisible. The highway was invisible. The desert itself had become a moving wall of suspended earth, and it was moving fast. She went back to her truck on instinct, got in, tried to start it. The engine turned over twice and died, the air filter already clogged with the fine alkali particles the storm had driven before it. She tried again. Same result. She was spending the night in the Desert Crown Casino. Cassie was not someone who panicked easily. Her father's raising again, but she was also someone who made realistic assessments. And the realistic assessment was that driving through a Nevada haboob with bald tires and a compromised air filter was a method of dying that she preferred to avoid. She had water in her bag, half a granola bar, her toolkit, the flashlight, and the crowbar. She had her phone, which showed a single bar of service that disappeared when she tried to use it and reappeared when she stopped. She needed to find a room with intact walls and intact windows. The service corridor on the north side of the building was lined with peeling velvet wallpaper that had once been burgundy and was now the color of old brick, and it led to a heavy oak door marked with a brass plate that said Management. Cassie tried the handle. Locked. She considered the door for a moment, then took the crowbar from her bag, positioned it at the latch plate, and leaned into it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had broken into enough stuck things to know the angle that worked. The door swung inward. The management office was not what she expected. The rest of the Desert Crown bore its 35 years of abandonment openly visibly in every surface, in every broken fixture. The management office looked as though time had simply declined to enter. The heavy wooden blinds on the two interior windows, they looked onto an interior courtyard rather than the exterior, were drawn fully closed, and the result was that the room had been sealed from the dust and the light and the casual vandalism that had touched everything else. The carpet was intact. The wood paneling was intact. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by leather armchairs whose surfaces had cracked with age, but whose frames had held. A brass banker's lamp sat on the desk's surface. The velvet-lined shelves behind the desk held a row of leather-bound volumes. Framed on the wall above the desk was a photograph, large professional, showing a compact, well-dressed man in his late 40s, shaking hands with a man in a suit, both of them grinning the wide grins of people who are very pleased with themselves and not particularly worried about the future. The placard below the photograph read, Dominic Farrow, Proprietor, Desert Crown, Casino Opening Night, October 1978. Cassie studied the photograph for a moment. Farrow looked like a man who was comfortable getting what he wanted and slightly bored by the ease of it. The man he was shaking hands with, a politician of some kind, judging by the practiced quality of the smile, looked considerably more nervous. She pulled one of the leather armchairs into the corner furthest from the door and sat down. The storm outside was audible even through the heavy walls and drawn blinds, a sustained low roar with occasional gusts that found the weak points in the old building's shell and pushed through them. The pyramid groaned in a way that was structural rather than alarming, the sound of a building that had been through this many times and knew what it required. Cassie pulled her tool bag into her lap and inventoried it from habit. Crowbar, Zippo, 2 spare flashlight batteries, a length of electrical tape, a multi-tool. Her father's Klein lineman pliers, the ones she had taken from his bench because she couldn't not take them, a granola bar, the water bottle down to perhaps a quarter of its capacity. She unwrapped the granola bar and ate half of it carefully and put the other half back. She drank some water with the measured discipline of someone who had done the calculation and knew how much she was allowed. Then she turned off her flashlight to save the battery. In the darkness, the sounds of the building resolved into layers. The storm was the topmost layer, a broadband roar that varied in intensity but not in character. Below it were the building's own sounds, the deep structural movements, the settling of concrete and steel under thermal change, the occasional crack of something small giving way somewhere in the upper stories. And below that, in the management office itself, the quality of enclosed airless silence that had been accumulating in this room since 1989 and was now being displaced gradually by the sounds of a living person occupying the space. Cassie thought about her father. She did this often, and she had learned that the thoughts came in layers too, the surface layer being practical, the kind of thing he would have said about a specific situation, and the deeper layers being something else, harder to name, the wordless residue of 35 years of proximity to a person who was no longer present. He would have had something to say about this situation, something brief and practical and slightly oblique in the way his most useful observations always were. He would have looked at the management office, at the undisturbed condition of it, and he would have said something about the fact that buildings talked, and this one was saying something interesting. She fell asleep sometime around midnight in the leather armchair in the corner of Dominic Farrow's management office with the Zippo in her left hand and the crowbar balanced across her knees. The sound that woke her was not the storm. The storm had diminished. She could tell that even before she was fully conscious, the roar reduced to a persistent whisper, the gusts no longer rattling the blinds. The room was still dark, deeply dark, the kind of dark you only get in buildings with no ambient exterior light and no windows to the outside. What woke her was mechanical. Clack, clack, whir. She was awake instantly, the way her father had always been awake instantly. The professional readiness of someone who spent years working on job sites where the wrong kind of sound meant the wrong kind of emergency. She sat still in the chair and listened. The sound came from behind the wall. Not the wall with the door, the wall behind the mahogany desk, the wall lined with dark walnut paneling, and the photograph of Dominic Farrow grinning his easy grin. The sound was heavy and mechanical, like gears, like something large engaging inside the architecture of the building. Clack, clack, thump, and then silence. Cassie sat in the darkness and listened to that silence for a long time, her fingers tight around the crowbar, her breathing slow and controlled. She identified 3 possible explanations in ascending order of probability: a mechanical fault in some remnant of the building's original infrastructure, which had 35 years to develop mechanical faults, an animal large enough to produce gear-like sounds inside a wall, which seemed unlikely but not impossible, or something she didn't have a third category for yet, which her father would have called paying attention before you name it. She clicked on her flashlight. The beam moved across the room. The leather armchairs undisturbed, the mahogany desk, its surface covered in the fine layer of dust that settled even in sealed rooms over 3 decades, the velvet-lined shelves, the photograph. She held the light on the floor. Beneath the desk, in the thick layer of dust that covered the carpet, there were marks. Not random marks, not the scattering of rodent paths or the disturbance of settling debris. These were deliberate, geometric, in the parallel lines of something heavy being moved across a surface in a specific direction. The lines ran from the front of the desk straight to the wall behind it. Cassie stood up. She moved around the desk and crouched down, bringing the flashlight close to the floor. The marks in the dust were fresh. Not today, but recent, within days. Someone had moved something heavy from the desk to the wall, or from the wall to the desk, or both. The carpet beneath the marks was compressed in the way carpet compresses under sustained weight, which was different from the way it compressed under movement, and the pattern suggested something had been dragged rather than carried. She raised the flashlight to the wall. The walnut paneling was dark and even a continuous surface of matched grain interrupted only by the photograph frame. Cassie studied the paneling for a moment. Then she reached up and lifted the photograph off its hook. It was heavy, heavier than it looked, and when she set it on the desk and turned the flashlight back to the wall, she saw what the frame had been concealing. Not a wall safe, not a breaker panel. What was revealed when the photograph was removed was a rectangular outline in the paneling, perhaps 18 inches wide and 24 inches tall. It seemed so precisely cut that they were invisible unless you were specifically looking for them and knew what joining work looked like. In the center of the rectangle at roughly chest height was a circular indentation, approximately the diameter of a quarter, a shallow, smooth depression with a narrow slot at its center. Cassie pressed her finger into the depression. Nothing happened. She looked at the slot. It was not a keyhole. It was a coin slot, the specific standardized form of a slot designed to accept a casino token, the kind of heavy custom-minted disc that casinos issued as house currency in the era before electronic accounting made them redundant. She stood back from the wall and turned the flashlight slowly around the room, thinking. A coin slot in the manager's office wall, behind a photograph that had been in place since 1978, which meant the mechanism behind it had also been in place since 1978, which meant Dominic Farrow had built it. Cassie swept the flashlight beam across the carpet near the desk, then across the debris field near the overturned photograph, then across the broken glass of the frame where it had shattered when she set it down too quickly. There, among the shards of glass, a small disc perhaps an inch and a half in diameter tarnished to a dark silver gray. She picked it up with her gloved fingers and rubbed the surface with her thumb, the grime coming away in a smear. It was a casino token. Heavy custom minted, the profile of a crown on one face and the words Dessert, Crown, Casino, Opening Night, 1978 on the other. The edge was milled in the distinctive pattern of a coin designed to be used in a specific mechanism, the ridges slightly higher than a standard token calibrated to something. Cassie looked at the coin in her hand. She looked at the slot in the wall. She pressed the token into the slot. It slid in with a smoothness that suggested precision engineering, the kind of fit that came from a mechanism that had been designed to work and had been waiting in the sealed darkness of this office for 35 years to demonstrate it. For a full second, nothing happened. Then, from deep within the wall, came a sound that was both ancient and entirely purposeful. The heavy, rolling clunk of counterweights disengaging the grind of a chain drive, coming to life after decades of stillness. The whir of gearing systems that had been manufactured to exacting tolerances and had, against all reasonable expectation, held those tolerances through 35 years of Nevada temperature cycles. The walnut-paneled section of wall moved. It moved backward into the structure of the building, and then it moved sideways, and it kept moving the entire panel, perhaps 4 feet wide, sliding with the hydraulic smoothness of something operated by serious mechanical engineering, until it had revealed an opening in the wall approximately the width of a doorway. Beyond the opening was a corridor. Concrete walls, concrete floor, concrete ceiling, the whole thing perhaps 5 feet wide and 15 feet long, lit by nothing, the air that came out of it cold and absolutely still, and carrying a smell that Cassie couldn't immediately categorize. Something metallic, something preserved. The smell of a sealed space that had been maintaining a specific atmosphere for a very long time. She stood at the threshold of the opening with her flashlight and her crowbar, and she listened to the sound of her own breathing in the distant diminishing sound of the desert storm outside. At the far end of the corridor was a door. Not a wooden door, not a steel fire door. A vault door, circular, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, set into the concrete wall in a frame of heavy-duty steel with a rotating wheel in its center that was the universal form of high-security locking mechanisms. The kind of door that bank vault manufacturers produced for institutions that stored things worth protecting. The wheel was not fully engaged. The door was not locked. It stood approximately 6 inches ajar, and from the gap between the door and its frame came a breath of cold air that carried the metallic preserved smell in a more concentrated form, along with something else. something that Cassie identified after a moment as old paper. A lot of old paper stored carefully in a sealed environment. She walked down the corridor. She put her hand on the vault door and pushed. The hinges had not been oiled in 35 years, and they were honest about this in the sound they made, a deep, multitonal groan of metal under stress, the kind of sound that makes you certain you are moving something that weighs what it looks like it weighs. But the door moved, slowly with significant resistance, the way things move when they have been very still for a very long time and have developed opinions about it. The door swung inward. Cassie stepped across the threshold. The vault was larger than the corridor suggested it would be. Perhaps 20 by 20 feet, the ceiling at 8 feet, the whole thing reinforced concrete on every surface. Her flashlight swept across the room in the automatic pattern she had developed for new spaces overhead. First, then the walls, then the floor, and in that first sweep she registered the following rows of heavy canvas duffel bags stacked against the far wall. Olive green military surplus style floor to ceiling, perhaps 30 of them. A central display table with a velvet surface, waist-high, positioned in the middle of the room. On the table, several objects that her flashlight touched in sequence. A gold-plated revolver, old-fashioned, its finish dull but intact. A row of leather-bound ledgers, large format, their covers embossed with dates. And at the center of the table, illuminated by the direct beam of her flashlight, in the cold and sealed air of the vault, a necklace. She recognized it. She recognized it the way you recognize something you have seen in photographs many times without ever expecting to see in person, the specific impossible shock of encountering a famous thing in an unfamous place. The necklace was a central emerald the size of a large grape, deep green, flanked by smaller stones, in a setting of platinum that was still bright despite the years, and Cassie knew the name for it before she had consciously assembled the knowledge: the Romano star stolen from a high-security exhibition in Los Angeles in 1988. An unsolved heist, an FBI investigation that had generated headlines for 2 years and produced no arrests and no recovery. The Romano star had a finder's bounty maintained by Lloyd's of London for 35 years. Cassie did not know the amount of that bounty. She would learn it later. What she knew in this moment, standing in the vault beneath a pyramid of broken glass in the Nevada desert, was that she was no longer looking at $12 in scrap. She turned to the ledgers. She opened the first one, held the flashlight above it, and read. The entries were not accounting records. They were not casino profits or loss statements or operational logs. They were names, judges, senators, federal agents. Names accompanied by figures, large figures, multi-million-dollar figures, and dates, and brief notations in a handwriting that was small and precise and entirely without sentiment, the handwriting of a man recording transactions that he considered simply business. The dates ran from 1955 to 1988. The names were not minor names. Cassie was still standing over the open ledger reading when she heard the footstep in the corridor. A single footstep. Deliberate. The step of someone who was not trying to be quiet because quiet was no longer necessary. She straightened slowly and turned to face the vault door. The man who stepped into the room was the man from the front row of the auction. The silver-haired man in the charcoal jacket. The man who had given her the pitying smile and told her she had bought herself a very expensive problem. He had changed out of the charcoal jacket. He was wearing dark clothing now. Practical clothing, the clothing of someone who had planned to be in a place like this. In his right hand, resting against his thigh with the casual authority of a man entirely comfortable with what he was holding, was a matte black pistol fitted with a cylindrical suppressor. "Mrs. Varden," he said. His voice was exactly as it had been in the courtroom, smooth, even unhurried, with the quality of a man who has rehearsed many scenarios and finds the current one to be among the less interesting ones. "Or is it, miss, you're young enough that I genuinely can't tell?" "Cassie," she said. "Cassie." He nodded as though filing this. His eyes moved from her to the open ledger on the table to the necklace to the stacked duffel bags. "Well, Cassie, you have saved me a tremendous amount of time." She did not run. The instinct was there. The vault door was still open behind him. The corridor was 15 feet long. The building beyond it was large and dark and full of things to hide behind. But Cassie Varden had spent 3 years watching her father make decisions under pressure, in the specific practical pressure of someone managing a terminal diagnosis, and what she had absorbed from those years was not courage in the dramatic sense. It was something more useful than courage. It was the ability to look at a situation clearly without the distortion of panic and identify what was actually true. What was actually true, the man in the doorway had a suppressed pistol and was standing between her and the only exit. The vault was reinforced concrete on 5 sides with a 6-inch steel door on the 6th. Her phone had no signal. No one knew she was here. Running was not a plan. Running was a way of feeling like you were doing something while accomplishing nothing. She stood beside the display table and kept her hands visible and her breathing even, and she looked at him. "You followed me from the auction," she said. "I followed you from the auction," he confirmed. He moved into the vault with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has done this sort of thing before, or at least has spent significant time imagining doing it, and is satisfied to find that the reality matches the preparation. His eyes swept the room with professional efficiency, the bags, the table, the ledgers, the necklace, and something moved behind them that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Relief, perhaps. The particular relief of someone who has been looking for something for a very long time. "My name," he said, "is Declan Ashby, though that's not entirely accurate." He positioned himself so that the vault door was behind his right shoulder, and Cassie was in front of him, the geometry of the situation arranged in the way of someone who thinks in terms of geometry. "My name is Declan Farrow. My father was Dominic." The photograph on the wall in the office. The man shaking hands with the politician comfortable in the way of someone accustomed to getting what he wants. "You changed your name in 1992, Cassie said. She was not sure why she said it. She was assembling information in real-time testing, whether what she was deducing was accurate. 1992, Declan confirmed as though she had answered a quiz question correctly. "Richard Ashby was my mother's maiden name. It seemed prudent after the federal investigation into my father's business activities." He paused. "My father was a complicated man." "What happened to him?" "He had a coronary in a motel room in Barstow, California on the 14th of November, 1989. 2 weeks after he sealed this vault and drove away from this building for the last time. He intended to come back when the situation with the federal authorities had stabilized." Declan looked at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of someone revisiting a story they have told themselves many times. It never stabilized. So the vault stayed closed. The vault stayed closed. He moved toward the table, keeping the pistol angled toward her, and looked at the necklace with an expression that was more complicated than simple greed. Something older. Something that had been waiting. "My father was, among other things, a brilliant engineer. He designed this mechanism himself, the false wall, the hydraulic panel, the coin-operated trigger. He was obsessed with things that looked like one thing and were actually another. He thought that was the essence of good design." He picked up the Romano star with his free hand, held it in the flashlight's ambient light. The emerald caught the beam and threw small green fragments of refracted color against the concrete walls. He hid the trigger in plain sight, as he hid everything. A coin slot behind a painting in the manager's office. The painting was hung the day the casino opened. The token was always on the floor in the frame's shadow, where anyone cleaning the room would have swept it aside rather than examined it. "You looked for it for 3 years. He set the necklace back on the table with a care that suggested he understood its value precisely. "I had the combination to the inner vault door he gave me that before he died, or before he became incapacitated enough that he could no longer speak, which amounts to the same thing. But I had no way to reach the vault without the trigger. I searched that office by millimeters. I walked past that painting perhaps 500 times. He looked at her. "And then you, a 21-year-old with a crowbar and $170 and absolutely nothing to lose, knocked the frame off the wall in the dark and found it in 30 seconds. "I wasn't looking for it," Cassie said. "I know. That's the part that would have amused my father." He moved back from the table. The pistol was still angled toward her casually, the way a person holds a tool they are comfortable with and don't need to think about. He believed that the best-kept secrets were the ones that required a specific kind of blindness to overlook. Professional searchers are trained to look everywhere. They bring systematic attention to every surface, every panel, every potential concealment. But systematic attention, he used to say, has a blind spot. It can't see the thing that's right in front of it because it's too busy looking behind things. Cassie looked at the duffel bags against the wall. Canvas olive green, heavy by their shape, the stacked density of full containers. Her father had shown her what packed bricks of currency looked like once in a news photograph, the specific regularity of them, the way they stacked the compression. She looked at the bags and did the arithmetic that came automatically. He said the cash is useless, she said. Declan looked at her with something that might have been appreciation if the situation had been different. You're quick, he said. Yes, the cash in those bags is approximately $40 million in American currency, mostly hundreds minted between 1975 and 1988. Untraceable in the sense that the bills carry no electronic marker and the serial numbers were never logged. But laundering $40 million in 1980s currency through modern banking infrastructure is an exercise in geometry. The numbers don't fit through the available channels without producing patterns that attract exactly the kind of attention I've spent 30 years learning to avoid. And the necklace. The Romano star is worth $8 million to a collector who doesn't mind the provenance questions. Finding that collector, however, requires a period of negotiation and intermediation that I estimate at 7 to 10 years and carries substantial risk at every stage. He said this not with frustration, but with the practiced neutrality of someone reciting an analysis they have already completed many times. No, the cash and the necklace are not the treasure in this room. He turned toward the ledgers. Those are, he said. Cassie had already read enough of the first ledger to understand what it contained. Names and figures and dates. Judges, senators, federal officials. She looked at the row of them on the table, 7 volumes spanning 33 years of transactions. My father, Declan said, was many things. A casino operator, yes. A man of certain flexible relationships with organized crime syndicates, yes. But his true business, the one that made him wealthy in a way that casino profits alone could never have, was information. He collected it the way other men collect art. He maintained it meticulously. He understood that information properly documented and properly held was more valuable than any asset on a balance sheet because information didn't depreciate and couldn't be seized. He kept records of the bribes. He kept records of everything. The payments made to federal judges who were then positioned to rule in certain ways on certain cases. The campaign contributions that were not technically campaign contributions. The bank transfers and the wire instructions and the names of the accountants who processed them. He moved to the ledgers and opened one with the practiced familiarity of someone who has spent time with such documents, though not these specific ones. There is a federal judge currently sitting on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals whose first judicial appointment was secured in part through a payment of $800,000 processed through my father's books in 1979. There is a United States Senator currently serving his 4th term in Washington who owes his first election to campaign infrastructure, funded through my father's organization in 1987. There is a former director of a federal law enforcement agency who received direct personal payments totaling $4 million between 1972 and 1985 in exchange for intelligence that protected my father's operations from investigation. The vault was very quiet. Those people, Declan said, are not retired. They are not disgraced. They are operating currently in positions of significant federal authority, and they are aware, they have been aware for 35 years, that these ledgers exist somewhere, that my father was careful that the documentation is complete. He closed the ledger with a sound like a small decision being made. They have been paying for 35 years to ensure that these books remain wherever they are. The arrangement has been maintained through intermediaries at a cost of approximately $2 million per year. They don't know the vault was here. They know the vault exists. They've been told it was secured. They've been told the documentation is protected. He tilted his head slightly. They have not been told exactly where. That information died with my father and his 2 closest associates, both of whom preceded him. I've been their intermediary for 15 years, managing an asset I hadn't yet been able to access, which required certain... He considered the word creativity in the reporting. Cassie was listening and simultaneously doing other things. She was tracking the position of the vault door, which was still ajar, approximately 7 feet behind his right shoulder. She was tracking the position of her crowbar, which she had set against the display table when she opened the ledger and which was now within arm's reach to her left. She was tracking the position of the pistol, which he continued to hold in a way that suggested he was comfortable with it, rather than actively engage with it, pointed generally toward her rather than specifically at her, the gun of a man who had made a decision and was explaining the reasons for it, which was a different orientation than the gun of a man actively executing that decision. She was also tracking the quality of the air in the vault. Her father had been an electrician, and she had learned from him that every enclosed space had a relationship with its own atmosphere. Buildings talked, he said. If you paid attention, they told you what they were doing with their air. This vault had been sealed for 35 years. The air inside was cold and still and old, the product of whatever the 1989 atmosphere had been when the door last swung shut, preserved by the perfect concrete seal of the walls and the airtight precision of the vault door itself. There were no vents, no intake grills, no mechanical exchange system visible on any wall. The air that was in this room was all the air this room had. She looked at the duffel bags, canvas full floor to ceiling, $40 million in 1980s $100 bills. Paper. Dry paper, old paper that had been sealed in an oxygen-stabilized environment for 35 years, which meant it had retained its original dryness, its original flammability, with none of the moisture that typically reduced old paper's combustibility. Canvas burned well, old paper burned better, and in an airtight concrete box with no ventilation at all, a sufficient fire would consume the available oxygen, and she estimated, working backward from the room's dimensions and her knowledge of combustion rates, somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes. I understand why you can't let me leave, she said. Declan looked at her with the expression of a man who has been expecting this conversation and is mildly surprised at its timing. I'm glad we don't need to spend time arriving at it, he said. I had a version of this that involved considerably more patience. You're going to shoot me and leave me in the vault. The vault is reinforced concrete with a steel door that locks from the outside. Whatever occurs inside it is, for practical purposes, permanent. He said this without inflection, the flat statement of a man who has thought about it thoroughly enough that the emotional component has been exhausted. I regret it, genuinely. You seem like someone who had several better options ahead of you and was simply in the wrong place. My father said that was how most bad things happen. He was right. He raised the pistol slightly, the adjustment of a man moving from the explanatory to the executive phase of a situation. I'm sorry, Cassie. Cassie looked at the pistol. She looked at the ledgers. She looked at the duffel bag stacked floor to ceiling full of 35-year-old paper in an airtight room with no ventilation. She reached into the right pocket of her jacket. Her fingers closed around the Zippo. Before you do that, she said, I want to show you something. He watched her hand come out of her pocket. When he saw the lighter, something moved across his face, confusion first, then a recalibration, then something that was not quite alarm, but was adjacent to it. The involuntary response of a person whose internal model of a situation has just received information that doesn't fit. That's a lighter, he said. My father's. He carried it since Fort Bragg. She held it in her open palm, then closed her fingers around it and flipped the lid with her thumb, a gesture she had made thousands of times, the motion in her muscle memory from years of watching Dale do it. The flint struck. The flame appeared small, bright orange, entirely stable in the dead still air of the sealed vault. Put that away, Declan said. His voice had changed. The smooth neutrality was still there, but it was working harder now, carrying more weight than before. I want to ask you something, Cassie said. You said this room has no ventilation. He looked at the walls, the ceiling. He had looked at them when he entered the systematic survey of a careful man. He knew what he had seen. That's correct. An average room this size, fully sealed with 2 people breathing in it, has maybe 45 minutes of usable oxygen. Less if there's any other combustion happening. She kept her eyes on his face and her thumb on the Zippo's lever, the flame steady. You've been a businessman your whole life. You understand oxygen as a resource. Finite, non-renewable once it's consumed. She stepped sideways to the nearest duffel bag. Without taking her eyes off him, she reached down and unzipped the top of it. The bag opened and the stacked bricks of $100 bills were visible in the flashlight's reflected light, neat, compressed, bone-dry. The paper had the particular texture of currency that had been pressed and stored for decades, dense and fine-grained the way paper becomes when it has had all its ambient moisture slowly drawn out over years. She held the Zippo approximately 6 inches above the open bag. "Don't," he said. The smooth voice had a crack in it now, a single line of fracture running through the professional calm. "Here is the math," Cassie said. She could hear her own voice, and it surprised her. It was steady the way her father's voice had been steady in the hospital, the voice of someone who had moved past fear into the operational space beyond it. Canvas burns. Dry $100 bills burn faster than almost any paper product available because currency paper is specifically engineered to be thin and dense, which means high surface area and low moisture content. 40 bags of dry bills in an airtight concrete room is approximately 1,200 cubic feet of fuel in an environment with finite oxygen. If I drop this lighter into this bag, the fire that results will consume the available oxygen in this room in under 3 minutes. She let the implication rest for a moment in the still air between them. The ledgers burn, she continued. The necklace survives. It's not flammable, but it becomes evidence in an arson investigation in a sealed vault, which makes it significantly harder to monetize. The cash burns. Everything your father spent 35 years protecting burns. And both of us are in a concrete box with no exits when that happens. Declan was not moving. The pistol was still pointed toward her, but the angle had shifted not toward her exactly, more toward the space between them, the way a gun moves when the person holding it is no longer entirely certain what they're pointing it at. "You'll die," he said. "Maybe," Cassie said, "but you'll definitely lose the ledgers. And without the ledgers, you don't have the leverage. And without the leverage, you don't have the $2 million a year. And without the $2 million a year, you don't have anything my father's money was worth dying for." She tilted the lighter slightly, the flame dipping toward the open mouth of the bag. "Is this the math you want to do?" The silence in the vault was the most complete silence she had ever experienced. No wind, no traffic, no ambient sound of any kind. Just the tiny sound of the Zippo's flame and the breathing of two people and the enormous weight of what was being calculated between them. "Lower the gun," she said. He didn't move. She moved the lighter another inch toward the bag. A bill on the top of the nearest brick had caught the heat radiating from the flame before it made contact. The edge had gone brown, beginning the first stage of ignition, and a thin thread of smoke rose from it into the still air and stayed there, not dispersing because there was nothing in the vault to disperse it. "Lower the gun," she said again. Declan Farrow looked at the smoke. He looked at the ledgers on the table. He lowered the gun. Not to the floor, he held it at his side, still in his hand, but the barrel pointing down, the body language of a man making a tactical concession rather than a surrender. He understood the difference, and he was signaling that he understood the difference. "All right," he said. "What do you want?" "I want you to step out of the vault." "And then what?" "And then I don't drop the lighter." He studied her for a moment with the assessing eyes of a man who has made his living reading situations and people looking for the angle, the leverage, the point of pressure. What he was looking for, she knew, was evidence that she was bluffing, that the steadiness in her voice and the unwavering position of the lighter were performance rather than substance. He didn't find it because it wasn't there. She was not bluffing. She was genuinely in the space beyond bluffing, in the place where the threat and the intention had become the same thing. And people who had spent their careers in manipulation could recognize that place when they encountered it, because it was the place where their tools stopped working. "I'll give you money," he said. "I have accounts offshore that are not connected to any name you know or any investigation currently active. I can wire $1 million to any account you designate within 24 hours. "Step out of the vault," Cassie said. $2 million. Enough to pay whatever debt you're facing, purchase property, establish yourself anywhere in the country. Step out of the vault." He took a step forward instead of backward. toward her. The gun came up slightly, a reflex, the body contradicting the tactical mind, and Cassie moved the lighter to direct contact with the top bill of the open duffel bag. The paper caught immediately. A small orange triangle of flame at the corner of the topmost brick, tiny, producing a thin column of smoke that rose straight up in the airless room and hung there. "Stop," Declan said, and the word came out with a force that cracked the smooth surface entirely. "Stop, stop." He stepped backward. She withdrew the lighter. Watching him, she pinched the burning corner of the bill between her gloved fingers, extinguishing it. The smoke trail thinned and disappeared. "Step out of the vault," she said. "This is the last time I say it. Before the next bill I light, I leave lit." He looked at her for a long moment. The calculation visible in his face, the geometry of it, the man who thought in shapes and angles, trying to find the angle. There wasn't one. She had removed it. The vault had one exit. She was between him and she was holding a fire source in an airtight room full of the driest fuel available. He took 3 steps backward into the corridor. "Further," she said. He took 2 more steps. He was now 6 feet into the concrete corridor, the vault doorway between them, the vault itself still visible over his shoulder. Cassie moved fast. She was across the room in 4 steps, the Zippo in her left hand, and the crowbar she had pulled from behind the table in her right, and she was through the vault doorway before he had fully processed what was happening. She heard him lunge forward, heard his shoes on the concrete, and she put her entire body weight into the vault door. The door weighed what it looked like. It weighed 3 inches of solid steel in a precision frame, and it moved accordingly, not fast, but it moved swinging on its ancient hinges with the same grinding protest it had produced when she opened it, and Cassie had the advantage of momentum in the clear knowledge of what she needed to do. And she had learned from her father that in any mechanical operation, clarity of intention was 70% of the work. Declan hit the door from the inside at the same moment it reached its frame. The impact shuddered through the steel and into her hands and arms, and she felt it in her teeth, but the door was in its frame and she was already reaching for the locking wheel. Her hands found it, both hands, and she spun it. The wheel turned stiff at first, then with the gathering ease of well-engineered gearing, and she felt the bolts engaging one by one, 4 of them. Each one a distinct mechanical thud inside the door's mechanism. The 4th bolt seated. From behind 3 inches of reinforced steel, she could hear faintly the sound of Declan Farrow's fists against the inner surface. It was not a loud sound. The vault absorbed it. The vault had been designed to absorb things from both directions. Cassie sat down on the concrete floor of the corridor. She sat there for a moment, her back against the wall, the crowbar across her knees and the Zippo in her hand, and she looked at the ceiling of the concrete corridor, and she breathed. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this as a factual matter, fine tremor in both hands, the delayed arrival of adrenaline chemistry after the executive function had used it up, and she waited for it to pass, which it did gradually over perhaps 90 seconds. Then she stood up. She needed to get to the truck. She needed to get to her phone. She needed to get somewhere that had a cell signal strong enough to call the police or the FBI or both, or someone who would know the difference and could explain why it mattered. She walked back through the false wall into the management office. The panel had remained open, whatever the hydraulic system was running on 35 years of stored mechanical energy or some other source she couldn't identify. It had enough left to hold the door in position. She looked at the room for a moment. The desk, the cracked leather armchairs, the empty wall where the photograph had hung, the nails still in the plaster. On the floor beside the desk, in the beam of her flashlight, the casino token lay where it had landed when she'd pulled her hand from the mechanism. She picked it up. Desert Crown Casino opening night, 1978. The ridged edge, the weight of it heavier than it looked. She put it in her jacket pocket. She walked down the velvet-walled corridor to the service door and pushed it open. The storm had dropped entirely. The desert air outside was cold now, the specific cold that follows a Nevada haboob as the suspended heat dissipates and the ground releases what the sun had loaded into it, and it felt, after the sealed concrete of the vault in the corridor, like the first breath after a long submersion. The Milky Way was visible overhead, brilliant and thick, the way it was only possible in places with no competing light for 50 miles in any direction, and the Black Pyramid stood in the starlight, its broken glass faces catching the diffuse glow and returning it in fragments, the scattered geometry of what had once been a 9-story mirror. She crossed the glass gravel parking lot to the truck. The engine turned over on the first try. She drove 4 miles south on Highway 95 before her phone found 2 bars of signal, and she pulled over on the shoulder with the engine running and the heater going against the desert cold. And she called 911, and she told the dispatcher as calmly and precisely as she could that she had locked a man named Declan Farrow inside the vault of the Desert Crown Casino, and that he had a gun, and that he was also the son of a deceased organized crime figure named Dominic Farrow, and that there were ledgers in the vault that she believed the FBI would want to see, and that the Romano star necklace was on the display table in the middle of the vault, and that she would wait in her truck on the shoulder of Highway 95 until someone arrived. The dispatcher asked her to repeat several things. She repeated them. Then she set the phone on the passenger seat and looked out at the desert, dark and enormous and entirely indifferent. And she held her father's Zippo in her right hand, and she let the shaking in her hands come back because there was no reason to stop it now. And she waited. The first sheriff's deputy arrived in 14 minutes. Cassie knew this because she was watching the clock on her phone, not from urgency, but because her mind had settled into the numerical after the adrenaline finished its work and counting was a form of steadiness. The headlights appeared in her rearview mirror at 2:47 in the morning, and by 3:15 there were 4 vehicles on the shoulder, 2 Washoe County Sheriff's units, and 2 unmarked sedans that had the particular quality of unmarked sedans everywhere, which was that they were marked by their very uniformity and the way the men who got out of them moved. She had stayed in the truck with the windows up and the hazards blinking, which was the behavior the dispatcher had instructed, and which also happened to be the behavior of someone who wanted it absolutely clear from a distance that she was where she said she was and was not doing anything that could be misinterpreted. The first deputy to reach her window was a young man named Gutierrez, who held his flashlight at the angle, suggesting he had recently finished his training and was being careful about the protocols. She showed him her ID, explained the situation a second time in the same sequence she had used with the dispatcher, and watched his face go through a progression that she found in retrospect entirely understandable. Skepticism, recalibration, the very specific expression of someone who has just understood that what they are hearing is going to require people from a different organizational level. He asked her to stay in the truck. She stayed in the truck. The unmarked sedans contained 2 federal agents from the Reno field office of the FBI, who had apparently been routed the call from Washoe County Dispatch based on the standing flag that had been attached to the Desert Crown property for the better part of 30 years. They were a man and a woman, both in their 40s, and they approached the truck with the particular quality of federal agents who have received a call at 2 in the morning and are not willing to commit to any specific emotional register until they have more information. The woman's name was Agent Serena Vaught. She had dark hair pulled back in the unhurried evaluating manner of someone accustomed to hearing unusual things and reserving judgment on them until they could be cross-referenced. She asked Cassie to walk her through the evening from the beginning, and Cassie did the 3rd time she had told it, and by now the account had the clean, sequential quality of something that had been organized by repetition. Not invented the way rehearsed stories sound invented, but settled the way accurate accounts settle when they have been stated enough times to find their natural form. Agent Vaught listened without interrupting. When Cassie finished, she asked 3 questions. The first was whether Cassie had touched the ledgers beyond opening the first one. Cassie said she had touched one ledger and opened it to read the first several pages. Vaught made a note. The second question was whether Cassie had removed anything from the vault. Cassie considered the casino token in her jacket pocket. She reached in and held it out. Vaught looked at it without taking it. That was in the room. It was in the frame when I knocked the photograph down. I used it to open the panel. I picked it up on my way out. Was there anything else? No. Vaught made another note. The third question was whether Declan Ashby, she used the name Ashby, which meant the name was already in their system, had fired the weapon at any point. No, Cassie said. He pointed it. He didn't fire it. Vaught nodded in the manner of someone receiving confirmation of a thing she had already suspected. She thanked Cassie and asked her to wait. Then she walked back to where the sheriff's deputies and the other federal agent were conferring beside the second unmarked sedan, and the conference lasted approximately 3 minutes, and then several vehicles drove north on Highway 95 toward the pyramid. Cassie was left with one deputy in the dark desert and the sound of her own breathing. She sat in the truck. She wasn't cold, the heater had been running long enough to bring the cab to a reasonable temperature, but she had the particular feeling of someone who has been through an extended period of sustained alertness and has now arrived on the other side of it, in the flat country that follows adrenaline, where everything is still technically fine, but the body is doing an audit to make sure. She held the Zippo. Her father had bought it at a shop near Fort Bragg during the last months of his time there, which was before Cassie was born, which meant the lighter was older than she was by several years. He had carried it every day of his adult life and never run it dry, which had always impressed her, the simple discipline of maintaining a small thing consistently over decades. She had asked him once why he kept a Zippo instead of a disposable lighter, and he had looked at her the way he looked when a question touched something he had thought about before. Because it can be fixed, he said. A disposable lighter fails and you throw it away. A Zippo fails and you figure out why, and you fix it, and it works again. I don't throw things away that can be fixed. She ran her thumb over the engraving. D.V. Fort Bragg. The letters, worn nearly smooth from the years of his handling as thumbprint, essentially pressed into the brass by repetition until the metal had conformed to the specific pressure of one person's grip. She had used it tonight to preserve what could be preserved. She thought he would have approved of that, though she would never know for certain which was the specific quality of loss that she had been living with for 8 months and had not yet fully named. The sun came up over the eastern mountains at 5:43, and the desert went through its brief, extraordinary sequence of colors, the purple and rose, and then the flat gold of early morning light. And Cassie watched it from the truck window and drank the last of her water and ate the second half of the granola bar and waited. By 7 in the morning, the Desert Crown property had been cordoned with crime scene tape that ran between the poles of a temporary perimeter fence that a county vehicle had deposited and assembled with impressive efficiency. 3 additional FBI vehicles had arrived, plus a van from what appeared to be an evidence collection unit, plus a vehicle with state plates that no one explained to her. The parking lot, the glass gravel field of broken pyramid panels, was traversed by people in protective equipment and people in suits and people carrying equipment whose function she couldn't identify from the distance she was being maintained at. Agent Vaught came back to the truck at 7:20. He's in federal custody, she said. Declan Farrow. He was inside the vault when our team opened it. He had sustained a knee injury that appears consistent with blunt force trauma. He's being transported to the county medical facility, and then he'll be arraigned. She paused. He'll survive to go to trial. Cassie nodded. The vault is intact, Vaught continued. The ledgers are intact. The necklace is on the table where you left it. She looked at Cassie with the assessing qualities she had brought to everything, the habitual evaluation of a person who processes information for a living. You locked a man with a gun in a reinforced concrete vault using a cigarette lighter. Zippo, Cassie said. There's a difference. Something that was not quite a smile moved across Vaught's face and did not stay. The ledgers, she said. I need to ask you something about the ledgers. I read about 8 pages of the first one. In those 8 pages, what did you see? Cassie thought about the small, precise handwriting, the names and figures and dates, the careful, unsentimental record-keeping of a man who understood that documentation was leverage and leverage was wealth. Judges, she said. Federal ones, names and amounts and dates, senators. An agency director, I think, though it used a title rather than a name for that entry. Vaught was very still. Were the entries dated? The one I read started in 1955 and went through 1962 on the first volume. There were 7 volumes on the table. And the entries were specific amounts, dates, identifying information. My father was an electrician, Cassie said. He taught me to read technical documentation. Yes, the entries were specific. Vaught made a note on her pad that she did not show to Cassie. Then she looked up. There will be federal proceedings and you'll be required to provide a formal statement and probably testimony. I want you to understand what that means in terms of your time and your privacy for the next period. I understand. The case will be significant. The names in those ledgers, based on what you've described and what we know of Dominic Farrow's operation, are not minor names. This is going to generate attention. Okay. Vaught studied her for a moment. You're 21 years old, you bought a condemned pyramid on an impulse, and you've just handed us what is almost certainly the largest single piece of organized crime documentation we've recovered in 3 decades. How are you doing? Cassie thought about this as a genuine question rather than a procedural one. I'm hungry, she said, and my water's gone. This time the thing that crossed Vaught's face stayed long enough to be identified as a smile. She turned and spoke to the deputy standing 20 feet behind her, and 5 minutes later, Cassie had a gas station coffee and a breakfast sandwich that someone had retrieved from somewhere, and she ate it in the truck while the desert morning completed its transition from extraordinary to ordinary, and the crime scene tape flapped in the first breath of the day's wind. At 9:45, a car arrived that she didn't recognize. It was a rental, a mid-sized sedan with an airport sticker on the bumper, and the man who got out of it was in his 60s, trim and well-dressed, in the deliberate way of someone who thinks about clothes as professional presentation, with a leather briefcase, in the slightly compressed quality of someone who has recently taken a long flight and is running on the professional version of being awake rather than the comfortable one. He approached the truck with the briefcase in one hand and a card in the other. Miss Varden. He stopped at the window. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I represent an underwriting syndicate at Lloyd's of London. I flew in from Chicago this morning. He held out the card. Would you be willing to speak with me? Cassie took the card. Arthur Pendleton, Senior Appraiser, Lloyd's of London. A London address and a Chicago office address and a phone number. About the necklace, she said. About the necklace, he confirmed. He had the careful, precise diction of someone who had learned English as a first language but had spent enough time in formal settings that casual speech had become a deliberate choice he made consciously. The Romano Star was insured by our syndicate in 1985 for its appraised value at the time. Following the theft in 1988, we paid the claim to the exhibition's insurers and maintained an active recovery bounty. Standard industry practice for high-value items where recovery remains theoretically possible. How much is the bounty? Pendleton set his briefcase on the hood of the truck, opened it, and removed a single document. He handed it to her. $2.5 million, tax-exempt under the applicable finder's fee statute. The figure has been maintained at this level since 1990. It is payable to the individual who locates and facilitates the recovery of the item contingent on recovery being confirmed by our appraiser. Cassie looked at the document. It was dense and formal and contained several clauses she would need a lawyer to explain to her, but the number at the top was clear. $2,500,000. She looked up from the document at the pyramid. In the morning light, it was a different structure than it had been the previous afternoon. The harsh shadow angles were different. The quality of the light through the remaining glass panels was different. The whole thing still massive and strange and profoundly out of place, but somehow less threatening than it had been when she had first driven into the parking lot. Like something that had already done its worst and could now be assessed on its own terms. The recovery needs to be confirmed, she said. Our team is inside now working with the FBI's evidence unit. The confirmation process in a case with this level of law enforcement involvement is fairly straightforward. The chain of custody documentation, the photographic record, your statement, all of that constitutes the confirmation. He looked at her steadily, the professional directness of someone who deals in large numbers and has learned that treating them as ordinary is a form of respect. The payment will be processed within 30 days of formal confirmation. You would receive a wire transfer to any domestic banking account. Cassie sat with the document in her hands and looked at the number again. $2,500,000. The mortgage arrears on her father's house were $64,000. The medical debt was $280,000. The truck needed 4 new tires and a replacement air filter and an oil change. She had been operating for 8 months on a combination of contract welding income and careful rationing that had kept her functional but not stable, the kind of financial existence that required constant management and produced a specific chronic exhaustion that was different from physical tiredness. She thought about the kitchen table and the manila folder. She thought about the mornings she had sat in the chair where her father used to sit and done the arithmetic 4 different ways and gotten the same answer 4 times. My father said she told Pendleton that when the table is cold, you roll. He blinked. I'm not sure I... It means you make the bet when it looks worst, she said, when nobody else will. She folded the document along its existing crease and set it on the seat beside her. I'll need a lawyer to review this before I sign it. Of course. And I don't have a lawyer currently. I can provide a list of Nevada attorneys familiar with finder's fee agreements. This is not an unusual situation for our office. He removed a second document from the briefcase, a shorter one, a single page, and handed it to her. This is a preliminary agreement acknowledging the pending claim. It doesn't commit you to any specific terms, but establishes your priority as the finder. I'd recommend signing it today. Cassie read it. It was a single page, and it said what Pendleton had said. It said without additional complexity. She took the pen he offered and signed it on the roof of the truck using her palm as a writing surface, which was not how she had imagined signing a document worth $2.5 million, but was practically speaking what was available. Pendleton took the signed page, put it in his briefcase with the careful movements of a man who handles important papers all day and has not dropped one in 30 years. I'll be in touch, he said. If you have questions before then, my card has my direct line. Thank you, Cassie said. He walked back to his rental car. She watched him go. Then she sat in the truck for a while and let the morning continue its work around her. The federal proceedings were not brief. The formal statement took 3 hours on the day following the discovery in a conference room at the FBI's Reno field office with Agent Vaught and 2 other agents and a federal prosecutor named Carver, who had arrived from the Las Vegas field office with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this case and was not going to allow it to be handled by anyone who cared less than he did. Cassie answered every question she was asked accurately in the same sequence she had organized the events in her own mind. She described the auction. She described arriving at the casino. She described the storm and the decision to wait it out. She described hearing the sound from the wall, finding the panel, finding the token. She described the vault and its contents. She described Declan Farrow's account of who he was and what the ledgers contained and what he intended. She described the Zippo in the duffel bag and the smoke from the burned corner of the bill and the exchange that followed. She described locking him inside. Carver asked about the ledgers repeatedly and from several angles, which she understood what she had seen before Farrow arrived was evidence, and her account of it was a form of evidence, and the precise content of what she had read in those first 8 pages mattered in ways that would take months to fully establish. She answered as precisely as she could, which was precisely enough that Carver's expression shifted during the session from the focused intensity of someone taking testimony to something that was closer to satisfaction. She was asked not to discuss the specific contents of the ledgers publicly, and she agreed, and she kept that agreement. The news broke anyway within 48 hours in the way news breaks when something involves enough law enforcement agencies that information cannot be fully contained by any one of them. The initial reports were about the arrest of a Nevada developer named Declan Ashby on multiple federal charges with a reference to the Desert Crown Casino property and a vault discovered within it. A week later, a longer story appeared in a regional newspaper that named Dominic Farrow and described the general nature of the documentation recovered without specifics attributed to federal sources. The story that appeared in the 3rd week named a United States senator. Cassie did not read the news stories carefully. She was aware of them the way you are aware of whether present influential, not fully within your control, or requiring your direct attention. She had given her statement, and she had been told what she was permitted to say, and she had said nothing else, which was straightforward. What was less straightforward was the 3 weeks of phone calls that followed the initial story. She had not given her number to anyone beyond the federal contacts, but numbers found their way to people who wanted them, and the people who called were a mixture of journalists who she declined and attorneys who she mostly declined while noting them down, and one call from a production company in Los Angeles that she declined without noting down. She retained a lawyer named Okafor from the list Pendleton had provided who reviewed the Lloyd's agreement and 2 other documents related to the federal proceedings, and who charged her a flat fee for the consultation that she paid with the last of her contract welding earnings, and felt briefly the specific lightness of spending money on something that was actually worth spending it on. Okafor told her the finder's fee agreement was straightforward and favorable, and that she should sign the final version when it arrived, which she did. The wire transfer arrived on a Thursday afternoon in September 31, days after the discovery. She was in the garage of her father's house. Her house. She was slowly training herself to say a correction that felt like work each time she made it, at the welding bench, running beads on scrap plate, the way she did when she needed to think when her phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. She set down the MIG gun and pulled off her gloves and looked at the number. $2,500,000. Posted, available. She stood in the garage for a moment, looking at the notification. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened the manila folder for the second time in 2 months. She read through the documents in order: the mortgage arrears, the medical debt, the various secondary obligations that had accumulated during and after her father's illness. She made a list which she did not need to make because she had the numbers memorized. But making the list was the organizing action, the thing that converted an abstract situation into a sequence of specific, concrete steps that could be taken. She paid the mortgage arrears first. She arranged the medical debt settlement second, using the account she had set up with Okafor's help, structured to retire it in a single payment at a negotiated reduction, which was Okafor had explained standard practice for large medical debt that had aged past a certain point. She put money aside for federal tax obligations that would apply in the following year. She established an emergency reserve. She paid the last 2 months of contract welding income she owed in taxes. She paid Okafor's invoice for the additional work. When she was finished with the list, she put it back in the folder and closed the folder and set it on the table. What remained after all of it was enough. Not vast wealth, not the kind of number that generated a second income on its own interest, but enough. Enough to stay in the house, to finish her degree, to have the truck fixed, in the garage roof repaired, in the heating system in the house serviced before winter. Enough to stop the arithmetic that had been running in the background of every day since March, the constant low-level calculation of what she had versus what she needed and how long the gap could be sustained. She had not realized how much of her processing capacity that calculation had been consuming until it stopped. The Tuesday after the wire transfer, she drove back to Highway 95. She had not gone back since the morning she had driven away in the dark, since the desert cold, in the Milky Way, and the sound of her own breathing settling back to normal on the truck's shoulder. She had thought about going back, but she had also been occupied by every practical consequence of what had happened. And occupied people find reasons not to do the things that are not strictly necessary. This was not strictly necessary. She drove the 12 miles from the city limits in the early morning, the desert still in its pre-heat clarity, the shapes of the Joshua trees distinct against the pale sky. The crime scene tape was still up at the property's perimeter, though the vehicle presence had reduced to a single county sheriff's unit parked near the service entrance, the officer inside apparently reading something on a tablet. She stopped on the shoulder of the highway rather than pulling into the parking lot. She got out of the truck. From the shoulder, she could see the full western face of the pyramid. The morning light was coming from the east behind the structure, and it created a specific quality of illumination. The pyramid itself in silhouette dark against the bright sky, but the broken glass on its western face catching the light that reflected off the desert floor and throwing it back in small scattered fragments. 1,000 small lights from a shattered surface, each one a piece of what had once been a continuous mirror that showed the desert to itself. She stood on the shoulder of Highway 95 and looked at the Black Pyramid for a long time. She thought about Dominic Farrow building it in 1978, the specific ambition of it, a 9-story glass pyramid in the Nevada desert, the audacity of the form, the way it announced itself across 40 miles of empty landscape, the way it refused to be subtle about what it was. A man who built things that looked like one thing and were actually another, his son had said. A casino that was actually a vault, a painting that was actually a door, a token that was actually a key. She thought about her father, who had spent his working life inside the structures that other people built, tracing the systems that made buildings live, the wiring that carried power, the conduit that protected it, the connections that completed the circuit. He had always said the most interesting part of any building was what you couldn't see. The infrastructure, the things that made it work. The Black Pyramid had infrastructure that no one had seen for 35 years, and it had waited sealed and preserved and patient until the specific sequence of events that would expose it had run its course. A man had built a mechanism, and a woman with a crowbar and a dead man's Zippo had been the thing that finally satisfied its conditions. She pulled the casino token from her jacket pocket. Desert Crown Casino opening night, 1978. The ridged edge, the weight. She had kept it without deciding to keep it the way you keep the things that were part of something you want to be able to return to in your memory accurately. Physical objects anchored memory better than words. She could hold the token and feel the specific pressure of pressing it into the coin slot, the smooth resistance before it seated the vibration of the mechanism engaging through the wall. She rubbed the surface with her thumb, the grime of 35 years worn partly away now from the hours of her handling it. Her father would have had something to say about this whole situation, about the pyramid, about the vault, about the lighter. He would have looked at the sequence of events and found the single clear line through it, the way he found the line through any complicated system, by ignoring the complexity and identifying the essential action. What had made the situation resolve was not cleverness, not luck, not the specific amount of money in the finder's fee. What had made it resolve was the willingness to stay in the room. Most people, when the table is cold, leave. The people who rolled when the table was cold were the ones who understood that cold tables were temporary states, rather than permanent conditions, that the absence of favorable odds was not the same as unfavorable odds, and that the worst possible moment to walk away from a situation was the moment when you had already committed to it. She had bid $170 on a pyramid in the Nevada desert because she was sitting in an air-conditioned room, and the room outside was 100 degrees, and she had heard her father's voice in the flat silence that followed the auctioneer's call, and her hand had gone up before her mind could object. She had not known in that moment that there was a vault. She had not known there was a necklace or a token or a false wall or 35 years of organized crime documentation. She had known only that the table was cold and that the $170 was the price of staying in the room, and she had paid it. Everything else had followed from staying. She looked at the pyramid one more time. The morning light was strengthening the shadows, shortening the broken glass faces, beginning their daily process of catching and distributing the Nevada sun. In a few hours, the parking lot would be a field of individual lights, thousands of them, each fragment of fallen glass becoming its own small mirror, the whole dismantled surface performing its scattered, continuing refraction. Her father would have liked that, she thought. The physics of it, the way something broken doesn't stop being reflective, it just redirects what it catches in more directions. She put the token back in her pocket. She walked back to the truck, started it, and sat for a moment with the engine running. On the dashboard, in the spot where her father had always kept it, the Zippo sat. DV Fort Bragg. The brass worn, smoothed by decades of one specific hand, the engraving nearly gone, the metal conformed to a grip that was no longer available to conform to anything. She picked it up and held it. "You were right," she said to the dashboard, to the Zippo, to the man who had kept it for 30 years and left it to her without instructions because he had trusted her to know what to do with it. About the table. She set it back on the dashboard. She pulled onto the highway, heading south toward the city, toward the house that was hers now, in a way it had not been before, toward the garage workbench and the welding projects backed up from the weeks of federal proceedings and legal consultations, in the sustained practical effort of reorganizing a life that had been reorganized once already by loss and was now being reorganized again differently by something that was harder to name than loss, but she was beginning to understand its own kind of weight. Not a bad weight. The pyramid shrank in her rearview mirror as she drove south, going through its sequence, large, then smaller, then the shape of it, without the detail, then just the dark vertical against the pale morning sky, then the glint of glass at the apex catching the light, then nothing, the curve of the highway taking it out of her sightline. It had been there since 1978. It would be there for a while longer. The county, she had heard through Vought, was reconsidering the demolition question now that the property had federal evidentiary significance, which meant the Black Pyramid was likely to remain in the desert for several more years At minimum, its broken glass continuing its slow conversation with the Nevada sun. She thought it probably deserved to stay. Not because it was beautiful, it wasn't particularly in the way that things built, with the primary intention of impressing people are not quite beautiful, but because it was honest about what it was. A monument to a specific kind of ambition, standing exactly where it had been planted, doing exactly what its nature required it to do. When the glass fell, it fell in the geometry of its own original form. When the light hit it, it returned the light in the specific way of its own materials. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. Her father would have respected that. Cassie Varden, 21 years old, $4,211 in the bank, on the morning she had raised her hand in the Washoe County Courthouse and made the worst financial decision of her life, drove south on Highway 95 in her father's truck with a Zippo on the dashboard and a casino token in her jacket pocket and $2.5 million clearing in her account. And she drove the way her father had always driven, steady, watching the road ahead, not looking in the rearview mirror any more than the road required. The desert was already heating up. By noon, it would be 104. By mid-afternoon, the shimmering heat haze would reduce the far mountains to suggestions, and the highway would look like something liquid, and the whole landscape would have its daily conversation with the sun, giving back in light what it received in heat, turning the enormous and different energy of the Nevada desert into something visible and temporary, and almost at the right hour beautiful. She rolled down the window. The hot air came in. She drove.